Welcome to the EconBuff podcast. I'm your host, Lee Stitzel. With me today is Dr. Trey Dronyk-Trosper. He's a senior economist at Amazon, has an impressive publication record, including Public Choice, Regional Science, Urban Economics, and Real Estate Economics, and maybe most importantly, the BE Journal of Economic Analysis and Policy. Trey, welcome.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
It's good to have you back on the podcast. Always good to have a second round at this. So today our topic is place-based initiatives. So tell us what those are, because I think most of my listeners are not going to be familiar with this.
Yeah, so these are initiatives, programs, policies, so on, that are basically constructed to target specific areas for development. In this case, we're talking about oftentimes this amorphous concept of economic development. It's not really necessarily like, oh, we're going to go build like a specific thing. Oftentimes they're more like, okay, we want to develop an area. So we have, this grassland area. There's no businesses, nobody lives here. Let's see if we can find some way to encourage businesses to move in or people to move in, things like that. And so the objective of place-based initiatives and kind of what they are is essentially a system for allocating funds to those areas for a variety of reasons. And there's a bunch of different kinds of programs, and they're all funded through different ways. Some are funded through collections of sales taxes or property taxes in those areas. Some are funded just out of general budgets, things like that. But basically the whole point is these are ways of investing money into very specific areas of cities, states, and municipalities. So
what level of government are doing these kind of policies? Is it federal policy, state, local, county? What are we looking at?
Yeah, so that's a good question. We normally think of governments as basically being like, there's kind of three tiers. You've got, at the closest, you've got your cities, sometimes counties, depending upon what state you're in, tend to take up a lot of that. But your city, your local, your county, then your state, then your federal. In the case of place-based initiatives, there's actually programs at all three levels. So this is something that all levels of government tend to take place in. Most of them are at the local level. So we're not real certain about the specific numbers because these are hard to track at the end of the day. But Bartik has estimated about $60 billion per year being spent on these every year. About 50 billion of which is local. So it's basically just cities and some cases counties. So the vast majority of this at the end of the day is local government making these decisions. There are some at the state level, and more recently there's been some initiatives at the federal level as well, like the new market tax credit, opportunity zones, things like that. But those are kind of the minority in terms of where our expenditures are coming from.
It makes sense to me that this would happen at a local level. If you're doing a place space, you're doing some kind of area rather than a specific project. So it makes sense that would be local. How could it be that a federal government could implement this program unless it's funneling money to a local government?
Yeah, so some of it is funneling to local governments, but a lot of times the federal government will set up the policy and then it'll be managed by a local government or by a state government. So, for example, in the case of opportunity zones, those zones, which are census tracts that have been designated as being low income or high poverty, these zones were selected by governors, and oftentimes they had local municipalities that would help select those. But those were selected, and then the mechanism behind that doesn't really require the federal government to make any decisions on what investments are being made. Instead, it's basically just a tax reduction for people that invest in those, and all that's done through the IRS. So whenever you go to your tax forms and you start doing your taxes, things like that, that's where the benefits come from. So whenever you set up these kinds of policies like that, all the federal government has to do is decide where these zones are going to be located or have some sort of mechanism for that decision. And then everything else kind of operates without the federal government, without some committee or group or department having to make decisions about what do we spend the money on. A lot of these that are going to be done at the state or at the federal level try to devolve a lot of those decisions out of their control because they can't really sit in there. So a lot of the decisions, whenever we're talking about like what are we going to invest in or what is going to be done, is either going to be done by the private people that are investing in there or by local governments who, if they're going to be building something for people that want to invest in these areas.
So this makes some sense. You're saying the federal government wants to do one of these kind of programs, it's essentially providing the funding. And I think when listeners are hearing that, they're thinking like, oh, we're going to take some federal budget and we're going to send money, and then they're going to give money in order to build things. But that's not really how these place-based initiatives really work. So you brought up opportunity zones and kind of how that works a little bit. So give us an example kind of in that context. Talk a little bit about how the program is actually working, right? Because it's not writing checks to people.
That's right. So there are some. The new market tax credit is a good example of something where you could end up with checks being sent out. But again, a lot of this is going to be done through the IRS. In the case of opportunity zones, these are what we call tax expenditures. And what that means is that instead of the federal government spending money, the federal government is choosing not to take in money they would have taken. And this is actually, tax expenditures are kind of an interesting component of thinking about how the federal government works, because a lot of times you might see something that's essentially, we're going to forego taxes to do something, and that looks like an expenditure, but it doesn't always go on a lot of the budgeting items that you might normally see, because we're just not taking in money. It's not that we're taking in money and then turning around and spending it. So in the case of opportunity zones, the way it works is once you invest in it, so you have an opportunity zone fund that gets set up in one of these opportunity zones, which again are these census tracts. And private enterprises, people will invest money in these funds. Now, depending upon how long they keep that money in these opportunity zone funds, they'll get certain basically tax breaks, mainly all centered around capital gains. So first, they can have some deferment of capital gains if they reinvest. So if they move the fund, move money from one investment into the opportunity zone fund, they can have a deferment, which essentially saves money, because if you wait to get taxed on something, generally it's more valuable to be taxed down the road. But then you also have a reduction in what's called the step-up basis. So what that means is the amount that we would tax, we actually reduce that by some percentage. In the case of opportunity zones, if you keep the funds in there for 5 years, we take 10% off. If you keep it for 7 years or more, we take 15% off.
10% off the gain that we make in the interim, or 10% off that initial investment that we move from one vehicle to another?
10% off the gain, so whatever would have been taxed. So if let's say we have $1 million worth of capital gains that we've invested in here, then 5 years from now, I would be taxed on only $900,000. Okay. 7 years, I would be taxed at $850,000. So if you imagine a 20% capital gains tax rate, you're basically saving, $10,000, $20,000, depending upon where you sit on that marginal tax rate. So it's a kind of a nice little benefit whenever you invest in these areas. The key thing about opportunity zones is that they have a third component, which is if you keep your money in there for at least 10 years, then any capital gains that have accrued since you invested, so note this is not the money that you originally invested, this is since then, will not be taxed by capital gains. So you basically get that money tax-free, whatever gets in there. And the reason behind doing this is to ensure that we're not resulting in a situation where people throw their money in there and then pull it out and nothing's basically done with that money. Right? They want to put the objective is to put money in there and incentivize smart decisions with the money that's in these opportunity zone funds, because any money you make could be potentially tax-free. And that's a huge gain compared to a lot of the other options that somebody may have whenever it comes to dealing with capital gains and how to reduce your tax burden there.
So I think we have this idea the federal government is setting up this fund. Who's administrating it? Who's running that fund?
So that's a good question. It depends upon, so the opportunity zone funds they can be run by private individuals. They don't have to be run by a member of the government, but they do have to be basically signed up for the IRS. So you would have the opportunity zone fund would be associated with an account, and then everything would be done through that. So the exact management of the account doesn't necessarily have to be like government or anything like that. It can be an individual. But in order to do that, you have to go through the IRS's process of setting up the Opportunity Zone Fund, going through the formalities of it. It's enough of a process that we're now seeing businesses set up whose sole goal is to help people get their Opportunity Zone funds registered, make sure the funds are doing what they're supposed to be doing, meeting all the IRS requirements, things like that. And they're getting paid to do that.
Yeah, markets and everything. That's good. So the federal government says this is a project we want to do, and we want to do it this way, opportunity zones, and we want to have these funds and dedicated census tracts. And I think you said the states are determining where those opportunity zones are, which census tracts those are.
So the governors were the ones that made that decision. So the funny part about this program, which may have some implications down the road, is that you could only nominate what we would call low-income census tract, which is census tracts that have at least 20% poverty or whose median income is 80% or lower of the state's income, median income, family income. So basically, lower income, higher poverty areas. So you had to select from amongst those. Of those, you couldn't select all of them. You could only select 25% of them that exist within your state. So there were limited numbers of them. The governor makes the final decision. So even though most states went through a process to bring in people to discuss this, they took it. A lot of states had discussions and had kind of robust analyses and things like that to kind of decide where they want to do this. They still had to make those selections. The governor was the final arbiter of who gets this, and then they submitted that to the federal government. Now, the key thing about this is that this happened over a course of 3 months in early 2018. So the law that created the opportunity zones was passed in December of 2017, and then all the opportunity zones had to be selected or at least nominated by March of 2018. And at that point, all the opportunity zones were set. There will be no more changes to the opportunity zones going forward unless lawmakers step in at the federal level.
What's the motivation for this? Seems odd. You have a 3-month window, pick the opportunity zones. Those are fixed, by this particular law, unless we get some. Do you foresee those changes or additions happening in the future? Why 3 months? Why not give us a year to work on it?
Yeah, so I think a lot of it was that they just wanted to get things going, right? It's that stereotype that if you don't put a deadline on something, when is it going to happen? So they set a deadline. Since the decision was basically sole arbiter by governors, it might mean that it's a faster decision to be made because you don't have to have the lawmakers in that state have to all make a decision, because that might take longer to get everybody to agree on something. But the governor just has to say yes, no on the census tract.
So were governors they take this pretty serious, or they throw darts at a wall?
No, they definitely took it seriously. There was a lot of efforts that went into this. It does vary from state to state. In some states, they had a very transparent process where they had, these are our timelines. This is when we're going to have stuff done. This is when the public can comment. I mean, in others, it was, a little bit more, I don't want to say backroomy, but backroomy. There might not have been as much public discussion, or the decision process was just kind of hand waved and said, yeah, we had some economic people look at it. We had some business leaders talk about it, but there might not be a whole lot of tracking of information about what happened.
So all those processes on the up and up, or are there some political shenanigans happening there?
That's a good question. I would say on average, they were actually fairly technocratic, given the nature of the situation. There's a lot of evidence that suggests that there wasn't a lot of political activities going on, but there has been some papers and some indications that there probably were, on the margins at least, some. So in particular, if a state legislator had a potential opportunity zone, so a low-income zone, they may have been more likely to get one nominated in their district if they matched the same party as the governor. So now that likelihood isn't a large percentage of total likelihood. So again, on the margin, it probably didn't have a big impact, but there is some evidence that happened, and that cuts both ways. We found that for both Democratic and Republican. They basically wasn't really party affiliated. It was just, do you match the party regardless of what party we're talking about?
I'm interested. I don't know if that's what I would have expected intuitively. A governor gets to be the sole arbiter, like you said. This seems ripe for opportunity to punish your enemies and benefit your friends.
It might be, but there might also be, right, so we're getting to kind of political economy discussions, but there might have been constraints, right? So governors might have felt like they couldn't do this too much, because then you might have a lot of, there might be a lot of pushback from the other side. You might have a lot of people that would be unhappy, and that might make your life a lot harder. So there's no reason to go too far in that direction unless you really want to, but you could pick your battles sort of thing. So, this one opportunity zone, maybe I'll think about it more because I really need to reward this state legislator, rather than saying, okay, if you're all the same party, you all get opportunity zones, which would have been, not only would that be very obvious that that's happening, but I'm sure there would have been a lot of reports about that, and there'd be a lot of bad publicity that comes out from it.
I'm thinking people didn't hear much about this, so it seems like it might have been a real prime opportunity if this is not especially high profile. It's a good way to do that. So first, the thing I'll say is, of course, this is a economics podcast. Political economy is very welcome here. So anything you want to say about that, we'd like to hear it. It makes me wonder, because one of the things that I'd like to talk about as a broad overarching theme of this whole podcast is, do place-based initiatives work? And if I'm a governor, I'm not spending any political capital. I'm not working against this constraint you're talking about at all if I don't think place-based initiatives are pretty powerful.
Mm-hmm.
Right? So it's like you're only trying to curry political favor. It becomes purely a political game, right? Because this might be something that my state legislator can take back to their district and say, look, I got opportunity zones for us. If those aren't like high profile, and if they're not working that well, what's your take on this? The governors, I mean, you're not going to have any sense of whether governors really think they work or not, but evaluate that as a potential explanation.
Yeah, it could be. I mean, we know, in the broader context of things, place-based initiatives from an economic perspective tend to have a lot of problems. They're not real. It's not real obvious that they work that well. There are some limited cases where we might see some evidence. So, Dave Newmark is a good example. He's written a lot about these, and he tends to have kind of a pretty negative opinion. Tim Bartik is another one who actually has a little bit more of a positive view on this. So you can kind of get both sides' views whenever you look at some of the research they've done. Bartik's view is a little bit more like, if we take the regional view of things, these work a little bit better. But if you take like the more close, the more you drill down. So like the neighborhood level, the view is place-based initiatives don't work because there's so much mobility, there's so much, capital can move around, businesses can move around, labor can move around, and people can commute. So it's really hard to target a very specific small area for development and have that be like the outcome, essentially. Whereas if you take a more regional view, doing something along those lines, you might actually see kind of more effect. So to some extent, it depends upon how you look at it. But whenever you look at the research and look at the literature, it's mixed at best. So some that target some of the things that you might normally think of as being helpful for businesses. So things like building infrastructure. Whenever you have place-based initiatives that are built around that, those tend to be valuable. They tend to be relatively low cost, and they tend to bring in jobs. Cleaning up pollution. So brownfield reclamation is another example. Oftentimes it's not too expensive. We're not talking about Superfund sites, which would be a different story. These are areas that are smaller and fairly cheap to reclaim, and those tend to have relatively good benefits. On the flip side, a lot of place-based initiatives will tend to result in kind of some potentially big problems because they're not really they're open to a lot of problems associated with things like push-pull mechanisms, malinvestment decisions, weird incentivization, or even rent-seeking behavior. That's hard to deal with because you're talking about large sums of money, and at the end of the day, local governments in particular just oftentimes don't have the funds or the inclination to be able to check up on this stuff. So it's not uncommon for a government city government might say, oh, a business wants to move in, we'll give them cash, for example, to move in, trying to convince a business that wants to move in. Would that business have moved in otherwise? If they would have moved in anyway, you're just giving away free money for no reason. If they wouldn't have moved in, why would they suddenly decide to move in whenever it's worth slightly less? Like, what other options did they have? Did you, in fact, add to like the sum total of economic activity in the United States, or did you just pull it from someplace else? Right? Was that going to locate in the town next door, Well, then all you've done is just moved a business from one place to another, which creates winners and losers. And so like maybe that's, if you're the governor of the town that now has that new business, you might, or the mayor of that town, you might be pretty happy. Like, all right, we got this new business. But you got that new business at the cost of another town. And so that's kind of where you get this problem of, did that actually add to economic activity that's occurring? Probably not. And in fact, if the initial idea was they should go locate in this other town, that might have been a better overall economic choice, right? This is the problem, is that once you start incentivizing decisions, you might result in less efficient choices being made because you've tried to get them to move someplace else. And so that might have negative consequences down the road, and that we've basically kind of were more inefficiently placing businesses than we might think.
So this you listed 4 things there that you think are reasons, and then you kind of also mentioned race to the bottom. So that might be an interesting thing to talk about too.
Mm-hmm.
But so the first thing you mentioned there was push-pull mechanisms, which is kind of what you were describing. So give us like something to hold on to as listeners. Like, what's a push-pull mechanism, and why would it make place-based initiatives not work very well?
Yeah. So the idea behind this is that you can almost think of it as cannibalization, right? So if I encourage a business to locate someplace, if the choice was just to locate where they locate, what I've done is I've moved the economic activity from one place to another. So a really good example is in Norman, Oklahoma, there's a TIF that is on the north side. And it's this nice thing. They're reinvesting this money to turn this greenfield into kind of a thriving shopping center. And it certainly has worked. If you go up there, it's a big place. Lots of buildings have moved in, a lot of businesses. It's very, very busy now. And so you would say, oh, well, the TIF worked, right? This is a place-based initiative. It worked fantastically. There's just so much activity. The problem is that, for example, one of the first businesses that moved in was Target, and people loved going there. However, there's a Kmart that closed not too long after that was in downtown Norman. What's going on? Well, what we actually see is this push-pull mechanism, where what we've done is we've pulled all the customers away from the downtown area, and now they're shopping at this other location. Have we added to total economic activity in Norman? Probably not. Instead, all we've done is just shifted everybody to go someplace else. Now, maybe that's a good thing for local residents on the north side of where they're close to this, but that also means that those people on the south side now have to travel further. They may actually be worse off. So this is where we're creating the winners and losers, and we're effectively taking a bunch of money that the city is foregoing to build all this stuff. They're basically reinvesting some of these sales taxes back into the construction in this area for what net effect? The net effect might be zero in this case.
Yeah, we got a new Target and got rid of an old Kmart, and we paid how much for that, right?
Exactly.
All right, so you mentioned a TIF. Tell us what a TIF is. We're inferring it's another type of place-based initiative.
Yes, these are tax increment finance districts. These are probably the most, outside of straight-up business incentives and cash giveaways, this is probably the most commonly used place-based initiative that we have. They're done at a local level, so cities will generally set them up. And what they do is they don't cost anything. So it's very much like an opportunity zone. It's a tax expenditure rather than an outright payment. And what they do is they take a portion of new taxes, either sales or property, in this area that they select aside. They take that and it gets reinvested into the area. So if you set up a TIF, you move in, let's say a business moves in. It collects some amount of sales taxes that then get returned to the city. The city will take some portion of that that's agreed upon in the setup for the TIF and set that aside, say, okay, this will go toward building more roads in that same area. It has to go to reinvesting back into the TIF. It could be for building more services, expanding, potentially like expanding other business opportunities in the area, things like that. They initially were created actually in California. Back in 1952, but just to give you an idea of talking about mixed effectiveness on these, California has actually removed their TIF now from their. You can no longer form a TIF if you're a city in California because of the mixed results that we've seen. TIFs don't seem to have a big impact. That's not to say they don't have necessarily an impact, but they might lead to a lot of growth. But on net, I think there's a lot of question as to whether or not it's doing anything advantageous, particularly given the amount of money that cities sometimes have to give up.
So you mentioned there that a business would give its sales tax or property tax back, and then the city would reinvest it into that area. It's not clear to me why that would incentivize me as a business to move into your TIF. If I'm paying the same in sales taxes, and then I send you part of it, and then you build roads so that more competitors can come compete with me, is that something that I really want?
It's a good question, but a lot of this isn't just, it can be things like, oh, we're going to beautify the area, things that might encourage more customers to come to the area. And there's also this, what we call agglomeration effects, right? So if you look at a lot of cities, you might realize that we actually have this agglomeration system going on even at a small level. So in a lot of cities, if you drive down a road, you might see a fast food restaurant. They're almost never the only fast food restaurant. You'll see chains of them, all along the road. There's a reason why Silicon Valley is called Silicon Valley, because oftentimes, even though you may be competing to some extent on like fast food or in tech, you're not necessarily competing precisely on the same things, right? So, if I'm a McDonald's, I may not necessarily be completely competing with Chick-fil-A and people that would have. And so if you bring customers in, some of them, by having that option, you may be bringing in more customers than you would have if you didn't have that option. So there's actually advantages to having those kind of grouped up businesses in the area. In addition, again, the city can also make sure those are nicer areas that may attract more people. So, the roads are nice up there, or everything all looks nice. Sometimes these TIFs include construction of buildings. So it might not just be, you can move in here, but we'll actually build the building you need to live in for your business. And then we'll basically rent it out, or maybe even just give it to you for free, depending upon what the city wants to do with it. But we'll provide a lot of that stuff that would have been expensive for the business to do.
So the agglomeration effects were in the same area and getting those kind of benefits of being people are thinking, where do I want to go eat? Let's go over there where all the restaurants are, and the roads are nice, and the sidewalks are nice, and it's safe, and it's easy to drive to, and on and on and on it goes. And it's just, this is where I want to go on a date. It's a nice atmosphere, etc. Rather than the McDonald's being sandwiched between a bank and a plant of some type, right? But there's also a really common one. Maybe it's harder to think about this in the context of like fast food or something, but agglomeration effects are also often because of supporting industries or even infrastructure things that are similar but not exactly the same as like attracting customers, but infrastructure that actually support your business there. Is that some of what you have in mind when you're talking about place-based initiatives?
Yeah, so that can certainly be part of it. So anything that's drive to bring somebody in could start that agglomeration effect. So I'll go back to Silicon Valley because it's just kind of the most commonly used example. But Silicon Valley is where it is, and it's well known as a tech hub, partly because once you get one or two tech companies in there, now you have other companies that know how to support them. So they know what things that a tech company might need. And so those resources are available if another tech company wants to move in and get started. You also have people that have worked at these other tech companies. Now you could hire them. So you have a lot of benefits for businesses to locate in an area because you can bring on talent that already knows what they need to do. You can contract out with businesses that know what they need to do to help you out, things like that. And so one of the things you can use place-based initiatives for, sometimes seen in other countries, like in Sweden and the EU to some extent, is you'll see these place-based initiatives started with the objective of let's start up an agglomeration effect. So we bring in something, and then kind of you hope that ends up pulling in others in the same business, and you kind of becomes your thing. So, universities are oftentimes thought of as a big agglomeration machine because whenever university is started in an area or exists in an area, you tend to see a lot more of the residents have bachelor's degrees. They have increased levels of higher education. And so that becomes a pool of workers that you can draw from, that local businesses can draw from. So it kind of brings in businesses not because necessarily the they can get money from it, but because a lot of the stuff that they might need or might be useful is already located there. And that makes, running a business a lot easier rather than having to worry to figure out, well, who am I going to hire? How am I going to operate in this area?
So we talked about push-pull mechanism, and then, of course, agglomerations is part of that. You mentioned a couple other reasons that we might not see place-based initiatives work very well. One of those things you mentioned was malinvestment. So go into that a little bit for us.
Yes, the idea here is, if I don't provide any incentives for a business, presumably, with caveats, they're going to choose the best place for them. So, if every place in the United States cost the same, there were no differences in incentives or anything like that, then the choices that a business would make would be the optimal for them. So whatever would make them essentially the most, profit given, opportunity cost and things like that. As soon as you start putting in those incentives, you start to change that calculus. So now you start talking about a situation where that business might have had its best outcomes in one location, but because you're giving them these incentives to locate someplace else, they move into a location where they're just not as good. And so you might result in a situation where you've built up an industry, or you've built up this group where the only reason why they're there is because these incentives, and should those incentives ever be taken away, then you've kind of pulled the rug out from underneath them. Now, that's kind of the idea behind agglomeration effect, is the hope that you can pull those incentives out and, you have this agglomeration effect that kind of counteracts that. But that's oftentimes not going to be the case. It's hard to get those agglomeration effects started in a location. And so what will happen is you just have this choice. Basically, you introduce inefficiencies in industry decision-making process because now they're going to be chasing those additional funds that they wouldn't have done otherwise, because they wouldn't have said, okay, I'm going to locate here, because they would say, oh, well, we're just not going to sell as much. Maybe there's a reason to locate in that place where they're not going to sell as much if the city is going to give them, $50,000 a year for being there.
So your cost so far, push-pull mechanism, not cost, but maybe cost, but definitely also reasons that you would see failure. Let's talk about race to the bottom a little bit, because we're talking about this idea that different cities might compete over attracting a firm.
Yes, you see this a lot with taxes as well. I think it's kind of a commonly well thought out, like something that just exists, right? So if you have to compete, what do you compete on essentially? If you're in labor, you compete on your skills, you compete on what you can provide to your company or wherever you work. Business, governments have to do the same thing. It might seem kind of weird that governments compete, but in fact they do. In that case, they compete on a variety of different things, and taxes can be one of them, incentives can be another. And really, it's basically just they compete on taxes and expenditures, which is what every government competes on. And what I mean by compete is, at the end of the day, if a government, like a city, wants, for example, new jobs to move in, they have to do that somehow. They can't just create them out of thin air. So you basically have to figure out some way to bring them in. How do you bring them in? Well, that's where the competition comes in. You can also see the same thing with people. So, a city might want to grow its population, particularly if it wants a tax base or if it wants to do, has some sort of objective. So you have to encourage people to come in. There are a few ways in which cities can compete, right? So a city in California might be able to advertise its weather, but that's not something any other city can do. So there are certain advantages that you can compete on. They're just kind of naturally there. But there are certain things that every city has that they can change, that they can compete on. And that's going to be basically how you collect taxes and how much you collect taxes and how you spend them, or what you choose not to spend them on. And so place-based initiatives are kind of a good example of some place where you can see cities oftentimes competing. So, I'll go back to this Oklahoma example. A long time ago, Bass Pro was considering moving into Oklahoma. And there's two big cities, essentially. There's Oklahoma City and Tulsa. And there was actually kind of a big competition between the two cities about where Bass Pro was going to locate. And so what happened was they started offering varying levels of incentives to try and get Bass Pro to locate in one of those cities. Now, of course, the key thing at the end of the day was that while Bass Pro would never admit this, they wanted to be in both cities, right? Because those are two markets separated by basically a 2.5, 3 hour drive. So you're serving two different markets. So as long as the markets are large enough, you could support two Bass Pro Shops. But you don't have to let the cities know that you want to build in both places. You can have them fight over you, and then take the best outcome, and then you could locate in the other city if you want to. Or if you only have the ability to locate in one. So for example, if the cities are close enough together, or if they're just the market size just isn't that big, then you have to make that decision where you want to go. And so the cities they might compete. So one might say, we'll give you $50,000. Another one might say, oh, we'll build you a building and you can locate here. And so that business decision is going to could be determined by that. And remember that at the end of the day, those cities are essentially they're either choosing to forego tax collection, or they're spending citizens' money to bring that business into that city versus another city. And so that's where you get that race to the bottom, where everybody's trying to compete over where a business is going to locate. And depending upon the decisions that the governments may make and policymakers in those areas, they may compete pretty heavily to do that.
So is there a Bass Pro in Tulsa?
There's a Bass Pro in Tulsa. There's a Bass Pro in Oklahoma City.
Okay, so they played them well then. That's interesting. Okay, so we talked about evaluating place-based initiatives and how they would succeed or not succeed, and sort of what are some of the motivations, which I think that got into well. Give us a little sense of the history of place-based initiatives and maybe some examples. We mentioned TIF and opportunity zones.
Yeah, so there's a variety of them. Whenever you're thinking about kind of the bigger ones, you've got new market tax credit at the federal level, empowerment zones and enterprise zones at the state and federal level. Again, those tend to be smaller in size. I think the really interesting ones are at the local level, where you have the tax increment finance districts, the TIFs. BIDs are a really interesting one as well. These are called BIDs. They're business improvement districts. I think they're fascinating because they're actually basically like a self-government, businesses self-governing in kind of a way, in that you get together with a bunch of businesses, they all volunteer to be a part of this system, and they actually voluntarily tax themselves. You don't really think about that very frequently. You think, oh, well, businesses don't want to pay taxes, but businesses are run by people, and everybody understands that you need certain things to run businesses. And so sometimes if businesses in an area feel like they're not getting enough services, particularly from the local government, for one reason or another, they could form a bid, and then basically they'll collect taxes from everybody in that bid, and then those taxes are then returned back to the bid itself. These are mostly used to, for example, hire additional police or security, garbage collection, like basic kind of services. They're not normally set up to like build skyscrapers or build anything like super crazy, because oftentimes these are relatively small amounts. But they are essentially like a kind of a quasi-governmental entity in that they have this taxing power essentially. There are limitations to this, obviously, and it's not they can't go crazy with this. But it is essentially a system where they get together and say, okay, we want some services, so we're going to tax ourselves to get those services, because any one business might not be able to afford it. But if you spread those costs out over several businesses, it might be a lot easier to afford that additional service that you need for whatever you're doing.
Are you familiar with the literature on this? What do economists have to say about the effects of that?
I think bids are kind of an interesting setup in that I haven't really seen a whole lot that would suggest they're necessarily negative, but I wouldn't necessarily say I've seen a whole lot that suggests they're super positive either. I think the idea here is that unlike things where we're talking about a local government saying, okay, I'm going to give you a bunch of money to try and get something to happen with some kind of objective, essentially you can almost think of it as we're going to try and pay for a job. So how much are we going to spend for each job that comes in? In this case, it's a little bit different in that the objective isn't necessarily economic growth or anything like that. It's just service provision. And in those cases, it's service provision with a willingness to tax ourselves. So it's, in some senses, almost kind of this weird question of, can there really be like a positive or a negative, for lack of a better word? Because, it's just, we're going to collect money to pay for a service. It's just like, is it a positive for a business to go hire an ad campaign? Things like that. Like whether it's valuable to you in terms of customers or anything like that might be kind of up to you to figure out. But the whole point is that these businesses have decided we really need more garbage collection. The city can't do that frequently because cities are limited by different levels of service provision. They can't technically differ their levels of service provision across a city. So you can't concentrate services in an area just because they would be willing to pay more. So instead, you can get around that by letting the business do it themselves.
So it's not a public activity; it's a private activity. This is elegant. Yeah, that's very clever.
Yep.
I mean, you could still have positive, negative externalities from that, but it doesn't seem like especially ripe ground for having external costs. So if it's just mostly private, right, this is voluntary activity, it's private, mutually
Basically,
beneficial
yeah.
exchange, and away we go, right? This is Principles 101. That's interesting. So you mentioned job creation in there. I want to talk a little bit about that, because we talked about the motivation for place-based initiatives being this sort of I forget the exact word you use, amorphous or sort of vague, like there's an area over there that's undeveloped, like we should develop that, so let's give incentives for that to be developed, and then we're not thinking about the cost-benefit analysis much beyond that. But you did mention job creation there, so how does job creation factor into the motivation for place-based initiatives?
Yeah, so if you go to planners and you go to city officials, job creation is almost always one of their top 2 or 3, big things that everybody's always concerned about. That's always the topic on everybody's mind. And so at the end of the day, a lot of these place-based initiatives are built around, they would say economic growth, or they would say these things. But in reality, what they're really trying to do is we want more jobs, right? Because jobs bring in money for the city. They bring in the ability to create services. They also bring in people that you can then provide services for. Like they grow the city, they ensure it's not shrinking. Like there's basically benefits. There's a lot of benefits to having jobs in a city and some sort of job creation system. And in fact, most cities, where you look at them, they will have some sort of an economic development council or a economic development program. Anybody who has a degree in economics can look at these and they're always interested in trying to find people that work for these. And it's just a lot of this is just evaluating like how should we help convince businesses to move in, or in other words, how do we create jobs? Most of the time the idea is, well, in order to create jobs, we can't really increase the size of current businesses. That's a little bit more difficult. So we just bring in new businesses. And so that's really what's going on is when we talk about economic development, they're just saying, okay, we need more jobs. So let's bring them in. And so that's where the cost benefit discussions start to come in, is this question of if your objective is in fact to create jobs, which some of these, they don't really have that objective, but essentially that's what they're trying to do. It's not always spelled out. You could actually kind of figure out, you could say, okay, I've created 10 jobs. These jobs pay $20,000 a piece, so I know how much activity I've brought in. How much am I spending in taxes? How much am I foregoing in taxes to bring those in? And is it worthwhile? And this is where you get into questions of a lot of times these city governments don't have the capacity or the ability to verify this stuff. So sometimes these things just kind of happen and nobody checks. In some bigger cities, you've seen pushes to do this. You've seen more transparent attempts. The Good Jobs First programs, things like that, where they're trying to where they're actually, in some cases begrudgingly, going through and trying to actually say, okay, this is how much we're spending per job.
This is where we circle back to that political economy that we were talking about, this public choice idea. Because they're getting, I've seen this at universities, I've seen this at city levels, where they're doing this analysis and scare quotes that you're talking about, but it's ignoring these kind of cannibalization, crowd out, malinvestment type ideas that you're talking about. They just add up whatever activity there is, ignoring that Kmart went out of business, right? So it's like, oh look, we have $2 million in sales revenue from this TIF, which includes the big Target, ignoring that you lost $1 million in sales tax revenue from Kmart, right?
Mm-hmm.
So what's your evaluation overall sort of this? Right, so economists sometimes have, there's some economists that make these kind of arguments that this job creation motivation is not a very good one. What's your evaluation of that in this context?
That's a really good question because I think I unfortunately, in kind of an unhelpful sense, I kind of straddle the line. I think it's just all nuance and kind of depends upon what you're talking about. I think in a lot of cases, what's going on is we're outputting lots of money for what amounts to relatively low income jobs, and I'm not sure that on net is really beneficial. But that being said, I don't think it's necessarily a bad thing to be trying to do this, particularly if we think about, right? So this is kind of pulling back a little bit. Trade is a really good example of where, depending upon what your objective is, you may be willing to take on things that are damaging to some people in exchange for helpfulness for others, right? So, I always give the example that let's say you have, 50 people, and I take, $1 from every one of those 50 people, and then I give $40 back to somebody else, to this other person. So you have diffuse losses and a big gain. That may be something that you really care about, particularly if those 50 people are all really well off and that person who we gave $40 to isn't that well off. Even if at the end of the day, note that we lost $10 because of inefficiencies in the system. So depending upon, kind of what we're talking about, if you're really doing a good job of bringing some of these lower income areas up and kind of really supporting them, it may be okay to be willing to accept some of those inefficiencies and some of those losses. I think the problem that we oftentimes see is that that's not what's happening. And that's where I think it gets into the question of, does it really make sense to be doing these in a lot of cases? And do we really want to be targeting jobs, or do we want to be targeting the infrastructure for jobs? That's where I think, the question really stems from. Does it really matter if I bring in a business, or would it be better spent saying, okay, I'm going to build all the roads, I'm going to get electrical out to you, I'm going to ensure that I've incentivized that we have higher education families in the area, or things like that, that gives the business everything they need to do well if they want to come. If you do that, then maybe there's what you've done is you've essentially provided services, which is kind of what the objective of governments are supposed to be. And if you could do that well, then I would argue that you shouldn't be chasing job creation. So, kind of in some respects, unless you're really trying to fix a big disparity in income or in poverty rates or something like that, where, maybe you can make an argument that's okay to lose out some. Outside of that, I think it makes a lot more sense to basically say, if I'm having to go out and try and find jobs because I need job creation, maybe I should take a step back and say, am I doing everything I should be doing in the first place? Am I providing the level of services I should be given my tax base? Because maybe the problem is you're just not really doing what we would like you to do yet. Once you kind of fix maybe some of those problems you're facing, then maybe you'll see that economic growth without ever having to say, okay, without having to bribe businesses to come.
You anticipated both of the things that I was going to say in response to that, because my first observation was I just don't think place-based initiatives have a great track record in actually. It was some of these initial tax increment finance districts in particular are literally targeted, and the word they used were at areas of blight. Right, which, if you're talking about it in a developmental sense of literally physically the ground is blighted, that'd be one thing.
Yeah.
But some of these are not, right? They're actually talking about really low quality housing areas and stuff like that. It's not obvious to me how you made inequality better in that context. So you seem to agree with that. So sort of in theory it could work, but in practice it doesn't? Or
yeah, I would say that's a lot of what we see is basically just that these are generally just not easy to do. And I will caveat this with the fact that when it comes to TIFs, when it comes to bids, those are a smaller portion of all the place-based initiatives. The largest portion by far are just direct business incentives and cash. And those are probably the worst kind. And so the largest portion of what gets spent is probably the worst kind, which is literally just bribing businesses to come here without having built the infrastructure, without having done all this other stuff that would be beneficial overall. And instead, that's the direct version of push-pull. That's the direct version of malinvestment. We give you enough money. You give somebody enough money, you can get them to do almost anything, right? And that doesn't mean it's a good idea. And that's kind of what we're seeing, is that a huge chunk of the $50 billion that state and local governments spend, something like $46 billion is basically direct business incentives and cash. And those are the ones that are generally going to be those are the ones who you're most likely going to be spending way more on bringing in a business than you're ever going to get back. And
those are the ones most vulnerable to race to the bottom too.
Yeah.
And then the second thing that you said, which I was going to weigh in when you were talking about this, but you perfectly anticipated it, is it is just fundamentally the job of local governments to provide the infrastructure for the businesses. So if you have somebody that come in that wants to have a business in your town, and they want to set up on this road, and they need electricity in there. I mean, this is just why we have local government. So, you want to be careful if you're thinking about these things. You want to say it is the job of the government to do these service activities, but it's not the job of the government to use those in a way that tries to actually manipulate the outcome that we get. Mm-hmm. You provide a good platform and good services and infrastructure and all that kind of thing, right?
Yeah. In an ideal world, you wouldn't have that. I mean, of course, governments are governments, and you're going to have people in there that are going to try and do those sorts of things. But in an ideal world, the job of the government is to collect the property taxes, the sales taxes for everybody that's in the area, and then return that in the form of valuable services for people. If you can do that, that should be enough to attract businesses. Now, there might be, and this is where it gets kind of wishy-washy, and that maybe there are fundamental problems with your situation or where you're located at, or things that cause businesses to not want to be there for a variety of reasons. And that's where, I think you can kind of say, well, maybe there is room for these sorts of things, right? There might be, a really good example, honestly, is rural America. We're having a lot of problems because, depopulation in these areas has really dried up a lot of business opportunities. And so what can a small town do to provide services whenever your tax base is leaving, right?
But let's take the holistic view here. As a nation, as an economist who cares about everybody, is that what I want to do? Do I really want to prevent people from going to the cities? Do I really want to prevent people from moving to those places where they potentially are happier, more productive, but all sorts of good economic outcomes? What's the value in dragging them back to a small town? And there are many people who love small towns, and they should be in small towns. So I think I can see some of an argument there that says, okay, you go to a small town, but if a few people want to be in a small town and that's just not viable in a particular area, that small town's going to go away. But it doesn't strike me as a very good policy to say, right, but we should force people to live in small towns so other people who want to live in small towns can. Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I think that this gets into the question of, like, how much do you want economic concerns to decide your, I don't want to say moral judgments, but it's more like who you want the winners and losers to be, right? So at the end of the day, all economic policies are all about who wins and who loses. And in some cases, there might be, some people have, and because of that, people can weight their preferences for who's winners and who's losers differently. And I think that's the big question, and to some extent kind of the big question that cities and states and the federal government has to ask themselves is, who do we want to be winner? Who do we want to be winners? Who do we want to be losers? Who are we willing to put in those camps? And how much are we willing to spend to do that? If we take all of that kind of moral judgment or those considerations out, if you're just talking about, from an economic efficiency perspective, it makes very little sense for these small towns to have these sorts of programs in place, or trying to encourage them to have these programs, because that would lead because those businesses left for a reason. Those people left for a reason. Most likely, by trying to force them back or trying to change the current trajectory that they're on, you probably are going to be introducing those malinvestment problems. You're going to be introducing those types of problems. The question is, is that okay with you? And that's the, again, that's getting like the political economy discussions where, is it okay to take that kind of situation? Is that who we want to have to be the winner?
So let me switch sides and take the small city side. Maybe people moving to the cities because the cities are wielding more political influence and doing more of this. They have Bass Pros and we don't out in the countryside. And therefore people are moving there. And how do you combat that? Do you want little towns then trying to compete in the race to the bottom that we were talking about?
Yeah.
Does it make sense to have small towns die because they can't compete in a political economy sphere where the balance would have been different in the absence of all of those kind of policies?
Yeah. And I mean, to be fair, some of the problems that we do see is that they can't compete on an incentive, right? So, we've talked about this race to the bottom, and all these cities are frequently doing these sorts of business incentives, these cash grants, things like that. If I have a tax base of $500 million, I could probably easily spend $500,000 to bring a business in. A small city, that might be an entire small city's budget, right? They cannot physically compete on that. So whenever you agglomerate that economic power into these big cities, then a lot of what you may be seeing is actually more just they can wield that, and small cities have like no response.
But if it's fundamentally agglomeration economies, this might be a good thing.
It might be a good thing, right?
Right.
Yeah, I think the issue is that we don't really. I think at the end of the day, there's pretty good evidence to suggest that in general, like urbanization has been a positive thing, at least in the sum total for the U.S. But it has created winners and losers, and whether you want to deal with that is kind of the big question, and that kind of underpins some of these place-based initiatives in the first place. Is essentially, a willingness to accept that there may be some people that will lose out in exchange for creating certain winners. And who you select as those winners is the big kind of question, the big thing that can cause a lot of fights over these.
So we're coming up on an hour now, so we probably need to bring this in for a landing. I think you've set us up for a perfect question to take us out here. What are the likely outcomes of most of these place-based initiatives in terms of those winners and losers?
Yes, that's an interesting thing to kind of talk about. I think we're already seeing some movement on some of these like TIFs. California got rid of theirs. There's been discussions in other states about removing them. I think that particularly over the past 10 or 15 years, we've seen a lot more questioning of place-based initiatives come in. A lot more realization that we should be actually checking up on these and analyzing them. And B, should we even be doing them? And I think you're seeing a lot of movement away from that, but I think it's going to be hard. I think this is going to be a long process, precisely because no matter what, a city can always feel that they always can tell the outcome, right? It's that thing where, if I give you an additional $1,000 to move here and you actually move here, I feel like I've done something. Right, and you can actually use that, and that's valuable to city planners and city governments. And so I think it's going to be hard to move away from that kind of idea that might not be the best way to spend that $1,000. So it's going to be a long process. I do think we'll see a movement away from some of these place-based initiatives. I think we're going to see a movement toward more transparency, so that people can analyze them. And kind of check and tag whenever some of these programs aren't working out well, and I think we are going to see a transition to place-based initiatives that are a little bit more designed for infrastructure, things like that. That's been a big topic recently. I think we're going to see more of that about what we're going to do is we're not going to try and necessarily get any specific business. We're going to do everything that businesses need, and then kind of say, hey, look at what we've built for you, and kind of hope that they can do it that way rather than set up these formal systems that sometimes don't work out well in the long run. They may work out on the short run, but they may be missing out on a lot of income, and you may, in some cases, might forgo a lot of taxes that could be well spent in the rest of the community whenever you set these up. So doing something that's a little bit less formalized so that you have that flexibility, because I think city governments are moving toward more flexible systems of revenue, more flexible systems of expenditures, and so on.
My guest today has been Trey Dronyk-Trosper. Trey, thanks for joining us on the EconBuff.
Thanks. Happy to be here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of the EconBuff. You can find all previous episodes on YouTube at EconBuff Podcast. You can check out our website at econbuffpodcast.wixsite.com. That's WIXSIT.com. You can contact us at econbuffpodcast@yahoo.com.